In 1826 May, Mary and Ayah arrived in London, having accompanied Eliza Scotch and Marian Grace Warner on the voyage from India in the East Indiaman Royal George. Mrs. Scotch and Mrs. Warner were sisters, the daughters of Sir Henry White. Both were the widows of officers in the Bengal Army. The following month, the magistrate at Malvern were asked to settle a dispute between Marian and her former employers. Mrs. Warner had found that some of her property was missing from the luggage. She had left on the ship with Marian, including a valuable writing desk, and she had asked the magistrates to investigate. Marian attended the Malvern police office accompanied by her sailor son, whom she had met accidentally in London. She told the magistrate that she had been promised a gratuity of £10 and a certificate of character on arrival in England if her service was satisfactory. She had called on Mrs. Scotch and Mrs. Warner in Malvern to be given these before she took a passage to India in the same ship as her son. Marian defended herself in English with a great deal of ingenuity, denying that she had stolen anything. She had been her fifth voyage to England, and she produced several certificates of good character from the families she had previously attended. Mrs. Warner asked that an officer should make a search of the trunks belonging to Marian and her son. She would be also to be the satisfaction of Captain William Reynolds, the commander of the Royal George, who was indignant that she threw her under suspicion. Nothing was found, but the sisters still refused to give the gratuity. There followed a long and animated dialogues in the Hindustan language between Mrs. Warner and Mrs. Scotch. Marian and her son, which the magistrate looked on. The sister said Marian had no claim upon them for the £10 and referred her to Captain Reynolds. Magistrate John Rawlinson announced that he could not decide between the parties since the contract was made in India, and he recommended that Marian should call on Reynolds at the Jerusalem Coffee House in the city of London. Mrs. Scotch wrote the address on the piece of paper, but Marian refused to take it. She asked her Rawlinson to write it down for her. Captain Reynolds wrote to Rawlinson stating that Marian's character was above suspicion and that she had conducted herself properly during the voyage to England. In his opinion, Mrs. Warner and Mrs. Scotch should pay the gratuity, and he asked the magistrate to help in the matter. Rawlinson showed the letter to Mrs. Scotch, and the following day her manservant came to the police office with Marian and handed over 5 sovereigns and 8 rupees as a gift. Marian accepted, and according to the newspaper report, apparently seemed satisfied. She left the office, making her obeisance after the Oriental fashion. Margaret Makepeace in lead curator, East India Company Records.